The air in the Henderson County Co-op hung thick and heavy, a familiar mix of stale coffee, fertilizer dust, and the damp wool scent of farmers' jackets. It was mid-April 1974. Outside, a stubborn spring wind was trying its best to dry the black Iowa soil, but inside, the talk was all about horsepower and acres. Dale Bishop was holding court, as usual. He sat perched on a stool by the counter, his brand-new red and white Pioneer seed cap pushed back on his head, revealing a forehead that hadn't yet seen enough sun to match the weathered leather of his neck. "And I tell you what," Dale boomed, his voice easily carrying over the clatter of ceramic mugs, "that new International 1066 is a whole different animal. Got the cab, the AC, the radio. Rolled up the windows yesterday and couldn't even hear that big diesel barking. It's like farming from your living room." A few of the older men in bib overalls nodded, their faces a mixture of admiration and envy. They were men who had farmed with Farmel H's and John Deere ass, who knew the taste of dirt kicked up by steel wheels. A cab with air conditioning was as foreign to them as a trip to the moon. Dale took a swig of his coffee, and his eyes scanned the room, landing on me. I was sitting in the corner booth, trying to mind my own business, letting the hot coffee soak some warmth back into my hands. "What about you, Jack?" Dale called out, a smirk playing on his lips. "You still wrestling with that old 40-20? Figure you'll have your corn in by the 4th of July with that relic?" The room went quiet. Every eye turned to me. Dale had a way of doing that, of turning a simple question into a public challenge. My tractor, a 1968 John Deere 40-20, was the subject of much local discussion. To me, it was the finest machine ever built. To men like Dale, it was an antique. I took a slow sip of my coffee before answering, letting the silence stretch just a little. "She runs good, Dale, and she's paid for. That counts for something." A ripple of laughter, led by Dale, went through the room. "Paid for?" he roared, slapping his knee. "You can't farm in the 70s with paid-for gear, Jack. This is the modern age. You gotta use the bank's money. Leverage. You buy bigger. You plant more. You make more. It's simple economics." He gestured out the window, where his gleaming 1-ton Chevy pickup was parked, a silver gooseneck trailer hitched behind it. Everything he owned was new. Everything was financed. He'd just bought the Miller place, the 160 acres bordering my north fence line, and he'd done it with a loan from the Farmers National that made Old Man Hemmings, the bank president, grin from ear to ear. "I'm putting in 1,000 acres of corn this year," Dale continued, his chest puffed out. "What are you farming, Jack? Still the same 240 your dad left you?" "It's what I can handle myself," I said, my voice low and even. I refused to let him get under my skin. My father's words were burned into my mind, spoken on his deathbed just 5 years earlier. "Son," he'd rasped, his hand gripping mine with surprising strength, "this land has a thirst. It'll drink up every dollar you've got and then ask for more. Owe no man anything. You pay this place off, you make it yours, and it'll take care of you. You let the bank own it, and you're just a hired hand on your own farm." That was my gospel. Every decision I made was measured against that principle. I still had a mortgage, a heavy weight that sat on my shoulders day and night, but my operating loans were small, and my equipment note was 0. That 40-20, my 6-row 7,000 planter, my old 4400 combine, they were mine, free and clear. I pushed my chair back and stood up, placing my empty mug on the counter. "Well, that ground won't plant itself," I said to the room in general. "Good luck to you, Dale." As I walked out, I could hear him start up again. "See what I mean? No ambition. Some fellas are just content to get by." The cold spring air felt good on my face. I climbed into my old Ford F100, the one with the primer grey fender and the seat springs that were starting to poke through the vinyl. The engine turned over with a familiar, reliable rumble. As I pulled out onto the road, Dale's brand new International 1066, hitched to a massive 12-row planter, came roaring down the highway from the direction of the dealership. It was a monster of a machine, with huge dual tires on the back and a chrome stack that belched a puff of black smoke as he shifted gears. He laid on the air horn as he passed my little pickup, a long, deafening blast that was pure arrogance. He gave a dismissive wave from his climate-controlled glass box and sped off toward his new acreage, leaving me in a cloud of diesel fumes and dust. I just shook my head and drove home. My farm wasn't flashy. The barns needed a coat of paint, and the house could use new windows. But it was neat. The fences were tight, the grass was mowed, and the gravel lane was graded smooth. In my machine shed, my tools weren't thrown in a pile. They were cleaned and hung on a pegboard, each one in its place. And there she sat, my 4020. She wasn't a powerhouse like Dale's 1066. She was rated at 95 horsepower, not 135. She had an open station, which meant in the summer I ate dust, and in the winter I froze. But that John Deere 6-cylinder diesel was one of the most reliable engines ever made. I knew every bolt, every grease zerk, every quirk of that machine. I'd rebuilt the starter myself last winter, and I adjusted the valve lash every 200 hours. The green paint was faded on the hood from the sun, and the fenders had a few dings, but the engine started with a quick bark and settled into a steady, reassuring rhythm. It was a part of me, an extension of my own hands. I checked the oil, topped off the fuel from the gravity tank, and climbed aboard. The seat was worn into the shape of my body. The synchro range shifter moved into gear with a solid, mechanical clunk. There was no radio, no air conditioning, just the sound of the engine, the feel of the controls, and the smell of the earth. I was going to finish planting my last 80 acres of corn today, come hell or high water. Dale could have his 1,000 acres and his mountain of debt. I had my 240, and a plan to make them truly mine. Before we get any deeper into this, I have to ask you all something. Have you ever known a man like me, who stuck to his guns and his paid-off equipment even when the whole world called him a fool? Or maybe you've known a Dale, a man who flew high on the bank's money and seemed to have it all figured out? Let me know down in the comments which one you've seen more of in your life, because I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll see how it all turned out. The sun was hanging low in the western sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and purple. I had maybe an hour of daylight left. The 4020 was running like a top, the diesel engine humming its steady tune. The planter units behind me were dropping seed into the dark, moist soil with satisfying precision. There's no feeling in the world like planting. It's an act of faith, a promise you make with the land. I was in the zone, watching the marker, keeping the rows straight, feeling the rhythm of the work. I was on my last pass of the headland when it happened. There was no warning, no clank, no bang, just a sudden change in the tractor's voice. The steady hum of the hydraulic pump, a sound I knew as well as my own heartbeat, went silent. At the same time, the steering wheel went heavy in my hands, fighting me like a stubborn mule. I instinctively reached for the hydraulic lever to lift the planter for the turn, and nothing happened. The big cast-iron implement just stayed buried in the dirt. A cold dread washed over me. I throttled down, and the engine obediently quieted, but the silence from the hydraulic system was deafening. I knew immediately what it was. The front pump. It was the tractor's Achilles heel, the one major thing I hadn't yet had to touch. It powered the steering, the brakes, and the rock shaft that lifted the implements. Without it, the tractor was just 9,000 pounds of useless green iron. I managed to wrestle the machine around and limp it back toward the farmstead, the planter dragging and gouging a deep furrow in the field. Every foot of the journey was a struggle. By the time I got it onto the gravel lane, my arms and shoulders ached from fighting the manual steering. I parked it in front of the machine shed, the setting sun glinting off the useless, silent machine. The next morning, I was on the phone with the John Deere dealership in town. A young man with a voice that hadn't broken yet got on the line from the service department. I described the symptoms. "Yep, sounds like your front pump, all right," he said, a little too cheerfully. "Common on those old 4020s. We can get you a new one. Let's see." I could hear him flipping through the pages of a big parts book. "Pump itself is going to run you about $600, and our service rate is $18 an hour. You'll have to get the tractor in here. We're booked up for about 2 weeks, though. It's planting season, you know." $600. My stomach twisted into a knot. That was more cash than I had on hand. And 2 weeks? In 2 weeks, this perfect planting soil could be a brick-hard desert or a mud pit. The season would be lost. "What about a rebuild kit?" I asked, my voice tight. Yeah, we can get you the seals and gaskets. That'd be about $85. But sir, splitting the tractor to get to that pump, that's a big job. You really need the right equipment. We wouldn't recommend trying that yourself." "Just order me the kit," I said, and hung up the phone before he could argue. There was no other way. I couldn't afford the new pump. I couldn't afford the dealer's labor, and I sure as hell couldn't afford to wait 2 weeks. I was going to have to do it myself. I was going to have to split the tractor. The first step was draining the lifeblood out of the machine. I placed a 5-gallon bucket under the transmission housing and pulled the drain plug. The hot, honey-thick high-guard oil, smelling of steel and work, gurgled out. It would take 3 more buckets to drain it completely. Then came the disassembly. The hood, the side panels, the fuel tank, the battery box. All of it had to come off, each piece carefully unbolted and set aside in order. My machine shed floor, usually swept clean, was quickly covered in the green-painted skin and iron bones of my tractor. The real work began when I had to separate the engine from the transmission housing. This was the part the kid on the phone had warned me about. The tractor was essentially built in 2 main halves, held together by a series of massive bolts. To get to the hydraulic pump, which was sandwiched between them, you had to pull them apart. I rolled my heavy floor jack under the clutch housing and used wooden blocks to support the front half. I hooked my chain hoist to a beam in the rafters and rigged a sling around the back half. It was a delicate, dangerous balancing act. One slip and thousands of pounds of cast iron could come crashing down, crushing anything, or anyone, in its path. My wife, Mary, came out to the shed, a worried look on her face. "Jack, are you sure about this? It looks so complicated." "It's just nuts and bolts, honey," I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Just a lot of them." For 2 solid days, I worked from sunup to sundown. I fought with bolts that had been rusted in place for 6 years. I busted my knuckles on sharp edges and soaked my clothes in grease and oil. I used pry bars and sledgehammers, my muscles screaming in protest. Finally, with one last groan of protesting metal, the 2 halves separated. I carefully rolled the front half forward on the floor jack, opening up a gap. And there it was, the source of all my trouble. The hydraulic pump, bolted to the front of the transmission case. I was filthy, exhausted, and my back felt like it was on fire. but seeing the pump, having it accessible, felt like a victory. The next morning, I drove into town in my pickup to get the rebuild kit. As I drove past the co-op, I saw Dale's truck parked out front. I knew what they were talking about in there. "Heard you were doing a little surgery, Jack," he said, that familiar smirk on his face. "Saw the 40-20 in pieces in your yard. Looks like a scrap heap." "Just some maintenance," I said, not meeting his eye. "Look," he said, his tone shifting to one of mock concern. "I'm about done with my corn. I could come over with my rig and knock out that last 80 for you. Save you the trouble. Call it $60 an acre. Cash." 60 an acre. That was robbery. The going rate for custom planting was less than half that. He wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to put his boot on my throat. "Thanks for the offer, Dale," I said, my jaw tight. "But I'll handle it." He chuckled and shook his head. "Suit yourself. Don't come crying to me when you're trying to plant in June." He hit the button, the window hummed shut, and he drove off, leaving me standing there in the parking lot, clutching a little cardboard box like it was my last hope. The laughter from the coffee shop seemed to follow me all the way home. That night, working under the single bare bulb in my shed, I felt a loneliness so profound it was like a physical weight. It was me and my broken machine against the world. I got the tractor back together. It took another 2 days of painstaking work, of cleaning every part until it shined, of carefully fitting new seals, of torquing bolts to precise specifications. The moment of truth came late on the 5th day. I had filled the transmission with fresh oil, reconnected the fuel lines, and bled the injectors. I climbed into the seat, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned the key. The starter whined. The engine turned over once, twice, and then it caught, erupting with a cloud of black smoke and settling into its familiar, beautiful rhythm. I let it warm up for a few minutes, my hands trembling slightly. Then I reached down and pulled the hydraulic lever. With a smooth, powerful hum, the big 3-point arms rose into the air. I turned the steering wheel, and it moved with effortless grace. A grin spread across my face, cracking the grease on my cheeks. I had done it. I had faced the beast and won. I got my corn planted the next day, just ahead of a soaking rain. The timing was perfect. And then something strange started to happen. The world seemed to shift on its axis. The price of corn, which had been hovering around $1.50 a bushel, started to climb. Then it jumped. News on the radio was all about a massive grain sale to the Soviet Union. Every day, the price on the board at the co-op was higher. It went to $2, $2.50. It touched $3 a bushel. Farmers who had been struggling for years were suddenly flush with cash. The mood in town was electric. It was like a gold rush. And no one was better positioned to ride the wave than Dale Bishop. With his 1,000 acres, he was a king. He sold his crop at the absolute peak of the market. The checks he was getting from the elevator were the stuff of legend. But Dale wasn't the kind of man to sit on his money. To him, money was a tool, and its only purpose was to make more. He bought the old Johnson farm, another 320 acres of prime bottom ground. He didn't just buy it. He outbid 2 other farmers so aggressively they walked away shaking their heads. Then he went to the dealership and traded in his year-old 1066 for the newest, biggest thing International had to offer, a 4966 black stripe with a powerful turbocharged engine. He bought a new, bigger combine, a 16-row planter, and a tandem axle grain truck. The bank was more than happy to extend his line of credit. In their eyes, and in the eyes of the whole community, Dale could do no wrong. He was a visionary, a genius, the very model of the modern American farmer. He was featured in an article in the Des Moines Register. There was a picture of him standing in front of his massive new tractor, his arms crossed, a confident smile on his face. "You can't be timid," he was quoted as saying. "Land prices are only going one way, up. Equipment is the key to efficiency. You have to leverage your assets and expand. In 5 years, the small-time guys who are scared of debt will all be gone." I read the article sitting at my kitchen table. Everyone knew who he was talking about when he said, small-time guys. My year was good too, the best I'd ever had. The check I got for my corn and beans was bigger than any I'd ever seen. Mary and I sat down at that same kitchen table and looked at the numbers. We could have bought a new tractor. We could have traded my old Ford for a brand new one. We could have added on to the house. But that wasn't the plan. The next morning, I walked into the Farmers National Bank and asked to see Mr. Hemmings. I slid my check from the elevator across his big oak desk. "I want to put all of this on the principal of my mortgage," I said. Hemmings looked at the check, then at me over the top of his spectacles. "All of it, Jack? This is a tremendous year. A lot of fellas are using this opportunity to upgrade their machinery, expand their operations. Dale Bishop was just in here yesterday." "I know what Dale's doing," I cut him off, more sharply than I intended. "This is what I'm doing." He shrugged and stamped the papers. I walked out of that bank feeling 10 pounds lighter. I hadn't bought anything you could see or touch, but I had bought a piece of my freedom. I went home and spent the winter in my shop, not buying new iron but perfecting the old. I tore down the engine on my Farmall Super H and gave it a complete overhaul. I replaced the sickle sections on my haybine. I welded and reinforced the frame of my old disc. To everyone else, I was a fool. At the co-op, the talk was all about Dale's new acquisitions and my stubborn refusal to get with the times. They saw my faded green tractor and my patched-up equipment as signs of failure. They saw Dale's gleaming red fleet as the banner of success. They laughed at the man who was trying to pay off a farm in the middle of the biggest boom in history. They called me backwards, old-fashioned, scared. I let them talk. I kept my head down, my hands busy, and my ledger book balanced. I was closer than ever to my goal. The farm was almost mine. But a new word was starting to appear in the papers and on the nightly news, a word I didn't understand at first. Inflation. The price of fuel was going up. Fertilizer costs were doubling. The price of a new tractor tire was astronomical. Everything was costing more, and the money didn't seem to go as far. One evening, listening to the radio as I cleaned grease from under my fingernails, I heard a broadcast. A stern-voiced announcer was talking about the Federal Reserve and a new chairman who had been appointed, a man named Paul Volcker. He was, the announcer said, determined to slay the dragon of inflation by any means necessary, even if it meant raising interest rates to unprecedented levels. I didn't know what it all meant, not really, but a cold knot formed in the pit of my stomach. Out my window, across the fence line, I could see the security light on Dale Bishop's new machine shed, illuminating millions of dollars worth of brand new, bank-owned equipment. The boom felt different now. It felt fragile. It felt like thin ice stretching over a deep, dark and unforgiving lake, and I could hear the first faint cracks beginning to form. The first sign of trouble wasn't in the bank or on the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade. It was in the sky. The summer of '77 started with a brassy, cloudless haze that hung over the fields for weeks. The rains, which should have come like clockwork in June, simply stopped. The corn, which had shot up in the early spring, began to curl its leaves during the heat of the day, a thirsty, desperate gesture. Day after day, the sun beat down, baking the black soil into a cracked grey plate. At the co-op, the mood soured with the weather. The easy laughter of the boom years was gone, replaced by anxious muttering and farmers staring at the long-range forecast, pinned to the bulletin board, as if they could will thunderclouds into existence. Dale Bishop was more on edge than anyone. With over 1,500 acres now under his name, his thirst for rain was monumental. I'd see him out in his fields late in the evening, kicking at the dry dirt, his shoulders slumped. The swagger was gone. My own 240 acres were suffering too, but my risk was contained. My operating loan for seed and fertilizer that year was a fraction of his. I watched my corn struggle, and it hurt my heart, but it didn't threaten my existence. I had a deep well for the house and the livestock, and Mary had a garden that we watered by hand every evening. We were going to be lean, but we were going to be okay. The drought broke in late August, not with a gentle, soaking rain, but with a fury. A line of thunderstorms rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised greenish black. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a freight train roar, tearing leaves from the oak trees and sending my empty feed buckets cartwheeling across the yard. Then came the hail. It started as pea-sized stones, then marbles, then golf balls, hammering against the tin roof of the machine shed with a deafening, violent clatter. In 20 minutes, it was over. The sun came out, glinting off a landscape that was shredded and battered. My corn was stripped, the leaves torn to ribbons. Dale's fields were even worse. The hail had been most severe on his side of the road, and his once proud corn was pounded flat into the mud. That fall, the harvest was a grim affair. Yields were less than half of what they should have been. The price, which had been falling steadily from its peak, didn't rally enough to make up for the shortfall. It was the first time in nearly a decade that the numbers just didn't work. For me, it was a losing year, but a manageable one. I didn't have any payments to make on my machinery. The big check I'd written to the bank 2 years prior had lowered my mortgage payment to a point where even a bad year couldn't break me. I sold my meager crop, paid my small operating note, and tightened my belt for the winter. For Dale, it was a catastrophe. He had massive payments due on the 2 new tractors, the combine, the grain truck, and 3 different parcels of land, all of it financed when interest rates were starting their deadly climb. The cracks in his empire began to show. One of his hired men was let go. The new machine shed, which he'd planned to insulate and wire that winter, sat unfinished. The real test came the following harvest. The weather was better, the yields were decent, but the machinery, Dale's pride and joy, began to betray him. His 2-year-old International 1460 axial flow combine, a marvel of modern engineering, suddenly quit in the middle of a soybean field. The digital tachometer in the cab went blank, and the engine sputtered to a halt. It wasn't a simple mechanical problem, not something you could fix with a wrench and some baling wire. It was a ghost in the machine, a problem buried deep in the complex wiring harness or a faulty electronic module. The dealer's service truck had to come out, a young mechanic in a clean uniform hooking up diagnostic tools that looked like they belonged in a hospital. After half a day of testing, he found the problem. A failed alternator that had sent a power surge through the system, frying a $50 voltage regulator and a $400 electronic monitoring board. The parts weren't in stock. They had to be ordered from the regional depot in Moline. For 3 critical days, Dale's $500,000 harvesting operation sat idle while a perfect fall weather window slowly closed. I was out in my own field, chugging along in my old John Deere 4400. It was a slow, dusty, noisy machine. It had no fancy electronics, just a web of belts, chains, and pulleys. When the bearing went out on the straw chopper shaft, I heard it squeal. I shut it down, drove to town, and bought a new $10 bearing from the parts store. I had it pressed in and was back in the field in under 3 hours. As I made a round along the fence line, I could see Dale standing by his silent red giant, his arms crossed, staring at the horizon as if he could will the delivery truck to appear. His face was a mask of helpless frustration. He was the captain of a technologically advanced ship that was dead in the water, and he didn't even know how to read the stars. He was completely dependent on a system he didn't understand and couldn't control. The bill for the service call and the parts came to over $1,000. That was $1,000 he didn't have. The whispers at the co-op grew louder. Dale was selling off some of his breeding stock, a sure sign of a cash crunch. He was late paying his fuel bill. His confident boom had been replaced by a short-tempered, defensive bark. The man who had once lectured the entire county on modern economics now looked like a man being hunted. The final blow came not from the sky or from a faulty circuit board, but from a man in a suit in Washington, D.C. The name Paul Volcker, which had been a whisper on the radio, became a curse word spoken at every farm table in the Midwest. To fight inflation, the Federal Reserve raised the prime interest rate again and again. It went to 15%, then 18%, then an unthinkable 21%. For me, it was just a number in the newspaper. I didn't have a variable rate loan. My mortgage was locked in at a comfortable 7%. But for Dale, and for thousands of farmers like him, that number was a death sentence. His operating loans, his equipment notes, his mortgages, they were all tied to the prime rate. Overnight, his interest payments tripled. The money he owed the bank was growing faster than his crops ever could. The land boom turned into a land bust. The price of an acre, which had climbed to $4,000 just a few years earlier, collapsed. It fell to $3,000, then $2,000. Suddenly, Dale's assets were worth less than his debts. He was upside down, his equity wiped out. The bank, which had once courted him, now saw him as a liability. Old man Hemmings called him into the bank. There was no friendly chat over coffee this time. It was a cold, hard meeting in his office. The bank would not be extending his line of credit for the next planting season. Furthermore, his existing notes were being called due. The words were simple, professional, and utterly devastating. Pay up, or we will be forced to liquidate. There was only one way out: a farm auction. The notice went up in the post office and in the paper. It was like an obituary for a living man. The date was set for a cold, grey Saturday in March of 1982. The whole county turned out, not in celebration, but in a kind of grim, morbid curiosity, like townspeople gathering for a hanging. They came to see the fall of the king. I went too. I parked my old Ford pickup down the road and walked up the long gravel lane, the same lane Dale had once roared down in his new International. The yard was a museum of modern agriculture, a testament to a dream that had died. The massive 1466 and its duals, the 1460 combine with its gleaming paint, the 16-row planter that had barely been used. It was all lined up in neat, funereal rows. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a microphone, climbed onto a hayrack and started the proceedings. His rhythmic chant echoed across the silent crowd. The bidding was slow, pathetic. The men standing there in their seed corn caps and insulated coveralls were all in the same boat. No one had cash. No one could get credit. They were survivors, not buyers. A set of nearly new tractor tires, which Dale had paid $2,000 for, sold for $300. A field cultivator he'd bought for $10,000 went for $1,500. It was a slaughter. Each drop of the auctioneer's gavel was another nail in the coffin of Dale's farm. I saw him standing by the side of the machine shed, his wife beside him, her arm linked through his. He looked 10 years older. His face was pale and drawn, his eyes hollow. He wasn't watching the auction. He was just staring off at the bare trees on the horizon. He had built an empire on sand, and the tide had come in. He had flown too close to the sun, and his wings of credit had melted away. I didn't bid on any of the big items. I had no need for them, and no money to pay for them. But late in the day, when they were selling off the smaller things from his workshop, a heavy-duty bench vise came up. It was a good one, American-made, and I needed one for my own shop. I bid $20, then $25. I got it for $30. As I paid the cashier and went to pick it up, I had to walk past Dale. Our eyes met for a moment. There was no trace of the old arrogance, no smirk, no challenge. There was just a vast, empty landscape of defeat. I saw in his eyes the reflection of my own father's words, the wisdom he had mocked and I had clung to. I just gave him a quiet nod, a gesture not of triumph, but of shared sorrow for a way of life that was being torn apart. He looked down at the gravel, unable to meet my gaze. I carried the heavy vise back to my truck. It felt solid and real in my hands. It was something I had paid for with my own money. It was mine. Dale and his family moved away a week later. The bank took possession of the house and the land. For a few years, they rented the ground out to a big operator from 2 counties over, a corporate farm that sent hired men who didn't know the land and didn't care. The fences fell into disrepair. Weeds grew up around the empty machine shed. The place looked haunted. I kept on as I always had. The 80s were tough years for everyone. Prices were low and spirits were lower. But every year I put a crop in the ground. I paid my taxes. I bought what I needed with cash. Mary and I didn't take vacations. We didn't buy new furniture. We lived simply, and slowly, very slowly, our savings account began to grow. By 1986, I had made the final payment on the original 240 acres. I walked out of the Farmers National Bank holding the deed, the paper crisp and official in my hand. The farm was mine. All of it. The weight that had been on my shoulders for 20 years was finally gone. I felt like I could fly. A year later, I got a call from a young banker who had taken over for Mr. Hemmings. The bank was still holding the note on the old Miller place, the 160 acres bordering my north fence line that had been Dale's first big expansion. It was a non-performing asset on their books, and they were desperate to get rid of it. He asked if I might be interested. I met him at his office. He laid out the maps and the financials. They had been trying to sell it for over $1,000 an acre with no takers. "Look, Jack," he said, "you're a known quantity. You're debt-free. You're one of our best customers. Make us an offer, a cash offer." I went home and talked it over with Mary. We sat at the kitchen table with my ledger books, the same table where we had made all the hard decisions. We had enough. It would take nearly everything we had saved, but we could do it. I went back to the bank the next day. $700 an acre, I said. Cash. The banker didn't even haggle. He stuck out his hand. Sold. That spring, I was out on my 40-20, pulling my old disc across that new piece of ground. It was rough. The corporate renters had let it go, and it was compacted and full of weeds. But as I worked the soil, turning the earth over, feeling the solid, reliable power of my old tractor beneath me, I felt a sense of vindication, so deep and so quiet, it was almost overwhelming. This was the very field where Dale had used his brand new 1066 to show me what a real farmer looked like. Now his tractor was long gone, sold for scrap or sitting on some other desperate man's farm, and my paid-for relic was still here, still working, still earning its keep. The men at the co-op treated me differently now, the ones who were left anyway. Many had gone under, just like Dale. The ones who survived were the ones who had been cautious, the ones who had managed their debt. They didn't call me backwards anymore. They'd come over and ask my opinion on things. They looked at my old, faded equipment not as a sign of poverty, but as a badge of honor, a symbol of survival. The world had turned upside down, and my father's simple, stubborn wisdom had been proven right. I saw Dale one more time, years later, in the early 90s. I was at the farm supply store in the next county over, buying hydraulic fluid. I saw a man in a grease-stained uniform working at the tire-changing machine in the service bay. He was heavier, his hair was grey, but I recognized him. It was Dale. He was mounting a new tire on a wheel for some kid's fancy pickup truck. He moved slowly, like a man whose spirit was tired. He didn't see me. I paid for my oil and left. There was no joy in seeing him like that. His failure wasn't my success. My success was simply the result of avoiding his mistakes. My own son, Tom, came home from agricultural college a few years after that. He had new ideas, new knowledge about the genetics and soil science, but he also had a deep respect for the past. He loved the farm. I knew it would be in good hands. One afternoon, I found him in the machine shed, just looking at the 4020. I had a newer, bigger tractor by then, a John Deere 4455, with a cab and air conditioning. I had bought it used, and I had paid cash, but I never sold the 4020. I still used it to rake hay and run the grain auger. "Dad," Tom said, running his hand over the faded green hood, "tell me again about how you split this thing on the floor right here." So I told him. I told him about the hydraulic pump, about the planting deadline, about the ridicule at the co-op. I told him about Dale Bishop, about the lure of easy credit and the brutal reality of the crash. I took him out, and we walked the 400 acres, all of it free and clear. "This land has a thirst," I told him, repeating the words my own father had spoken to me so long ago. "It'll drink up every dollar you've got and then ask for more. You keep your debts low and your iron paid for, and this place will take care of you. You let the bank own it, and you're just a hired hand on your own farm." He nodded, his young face serious. He understood. The lesson had been passed on. Now, I'm an old man. My hands are gnarled and stiff, but I can still climb up onto the seat of that 4020. Tom does most of the heavy work now, but sometimes, on a warm spring evening, I'll take the old tractor out and disc a field, just for the feel of it. There's no radio to distract me. There's just the steady, reassuring thrum of that 6-cylinder diesel, a sound I know better than my own name. I look out over the long, straight rows of freshly turned earth, stretching across the hills that are truly, completely mine. The setting sun warms my face, and I feel a sense of peace that no amount of money could ever buy.